Hi, welcome to Max in Minutes from Focal Press and 3dforgames.com. In this video, we'll be following on from an earlier video in the series which covered the creation of plants, grass and bushes for video games. We'll be building on this and we'll cover the creation of a tree wall and a tree to add to the scene that contain the plants, grass and bush models. For this video, I presume you have a basic understanding of Max and be familiar with the main modelling tools and application of basic shaders. If you're not, please refer to the earlier videos in the series to get up to speed. The first thing we'll tackle is a tree wall. The term tree wall refers to a flat shape or plane which has a texture map applied to it of a line of trees. Tree walls are usually placed in the far extremities of an environment behind other assets to add as a backdrop to the scene cheaply. The player should never usually be able to get too close to tree walls. It's good to keep this in mind when building an environment. This technique can also be used to create a backdrop of buildings, mountains or whatever for the back of your scene. We'll start in Photoshop with the photo reference. The first thing I did was to crop and resize the image to be a width of 1024 pixels and a height of 512 pixels. I then decided that the image was not quite within the colour range I wanted. I corrected the colours with the hue and saturation options found under the main menu, Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation. I moved the hue towards a greener tone, desaturated and darkened the image slightly. I then moved on to the Channels tab and created a new channel to use as my alpha channel. Using the lasso tool, I drew around the shape of the trees I wanted to appear in the tree wall. Select the lasso tool and hold the left mouse button and drag or draw around the desired area. Using this selection, I painted the inside of the selection white to be the opaque areas of my texture with the brush tool. If you want to save the alpha channel as a separate map, you can do this by pressing Ctrl A over the alpha channel to select it, then Ctrl C to copy the selection and Ctrl V on a new layer in the Layers tab to paste it. Then save your file as a separate texture after flattening the image. I then needed to paint a more accurate alpha channel, so I grabbed the Spatter 27 brush and started painting. This brush is good for areas around the leaves as it creates a nice random noisy edge. After doing this, I still noticed some areas in the interior of the selection that have sky showing through the leaves. I used the clone stamp tool to copy areas of the leaves and stamp over these bits. When this was complete, I ended up with the final layer. As a last touch, I duplicated the layer, Ctrl J, and desaturated it, Shift Ctrl U. I then set the blend mode to multiply with the layer sitting over the final layer. This helped give the image more contrast and darkened it in areas. All that's left to do is to save the image out as a diffused texture with the alpha channel in a format that stores the alpha information. Some file formats which support this are BMP, PNG, TIFF and DDS. Next, I move into 3dsMax. This model was simple as it's a plane. I created it with the width twice the height so it matches the texture and planar mapped it, assigning the tree wall texture. That's the most basic form you can get of a tree wall. There are many variations and techniques that can be used. Your project requirements should help you decide which approach is best. For another example, I created a plane with some divisions and moved rows of vertices to create a rounder surface. Another example was to use a selection of a cylinder and tile the tree wall around it. This would work better with a tiling tree wall texture. The last tree wall example can work with any of the above methods. I chose to show it with a simple plane. I took the plane and imported a few of the vegetation assets and placed them in front of the tree wall. Afterwards, I combined them all together. The idea is to layer the assets up in front of the tree wall to add depth to it whilst keeping the new elements as cheap as they can be. The trees have about 50% less polygons than the version of the tree we'll look at next. The next tree model will be made from two different components: the model trunk and the main branches, and then the alpha textured planes duplicated and positioned to create the foliage. I'll now go through and show each stage of how I built the trunk model. The first step I took was to create a 7-sided cylinder. The amount of sides would depend on how smooth you want the trunk and how expensive the model can be. I was aiming for a final triangle count of about 500. The next step was to delete the top and bottom faces as they're not needed. I then used the slice tool to cut in 3 edge loops. I moved and scaled each edge loop to gradually taper the trunk as it goes up. Alternatively, you could have created the cylinder with 4 height segments and 7 sides. Once I was happy with the shape for now, I duplicated and scaled it to use as a base for the large branches. I then optimised the mesh to be 5-sided instead of 7, as the branches are not as thick. I repeated this 5 more times to create other branches. I followed my reference to get the overall look of them right, and I edited the branches by moving the edge loops to create bends, changing the shape of each one. Once I was satisfied with the result, I proceeded to combine all the meshes into one single object. I then started cutting in each branch into the trunk so it was a solid mesh, with all the branches connected to the trunk. It would have been possible to have these as floating geometry with the branches intersecting the trunk, but with the floating branches example I have here, you can see the shading doesn't work as well. The solid model looks a lot better. Next is the unwrapping of the trunk model. For this I used a cylindrical mapping tool after applying an unwrap UVW modifier. I selected one section at a time and applied the cylindrical unwrap and used the best align function. Then, in the Edit View UVs window, I used the Weld tool, Ctrl T, to stitch all the sections back together as you can see here. I'll do a quick demonstration of one of the pieces to show you the process. I'll select the bottom faces of the trunk. Apply a cylindrical unwrap and select the best align option, before moving on to Edit UVs window. I then move the UV shell into position near the shared edges and select an edge to make sure they match up. If they don't, we can use the break option to separate and rearrange the faces in the correct order, making sure we join them together again afterwards by selecting all of the shared edges and using the stitch button or target weld, which welds the UV shells together. After repeating these steps to unwrap the trunk and all the branches, we can then proceed with creating the foliage. Briefly jumping into Photoshop, let's have a look at the texture. I created this image by extracting some leaves on a branch from a photo and then made some duplicates. I then positioned them to fill up as much of the texture in the centre as possible, whilst leaving the edges emptier to give a nice silhouette. Also, the less alpha in the texture, the cheaper it will be to render, as there'll be less overdraw. So this is a balancing act between what looks good and what's optimal to render. After that, I created an alpha channel for the foliage. The steps to do this were covered in more depth in the previous foliage video in the series. One other thing to note is that I also took a section of the trunk texture to create the branch and the foliage texture to match the two textures better. This can be seen in the bottom left corner. Moving back into Max, we can take a look at the two shapes I built with the texture applied to create the foliage. I created a square plane and a plane with divisions in it. I then moved the central vertex of this one to add some shape and depth to the foliage. Both are cheap and will help keep the polygon count down, as we'll need a lot of these. Making duplicates of the flat plane, I started positioning them on the tree model working from the centre outwards. The reason for this was to ensure the centre of the foliage is dense and then fades off as it extends out. After I was happy with the level of coverage the flat planes had provided, I began to introduce a second shape and continued to fill out the tree with a mixture of both foliage shapes. I made sure that I positioned the more expensive shapes around the lower extremities of the foliage, so that if a player ever looks up at the foliage from below, they'll not see all the flat planes. This is the main trick of creating the foliage with this method, ensuring that there's enough coverage that it's never too obvious the foliage is a cluster of planes, or at least you don't get large gaps in the foliage from certain angles. With this method, it's almost impossible to hide this fact, but there are some ways to help avoid it. The main failing of this method is lighting them. The lighting in a game engine would see the foliage as being planes, although a good lighting setup always benefits this type of model. When I started the tree, I set out for a budget of around 500 triangles. This came in at 509, so this is where I decided to stop. I could have used more complex shapes of the foliage, but this would have made it more expensive. It would look nicer though. Take some time to experiment with different shapes and forms for creating foliage, as each tree, plant or bush grows differently. This completes the creation of the tree. The final step is to combine everything into one model. I tend to move the pivot point to the base of the trunk as it makes it easier to position. After completing this model, I created a cheaper version of the tree to use as a distant version. I reduced the trunk geometry and only used the flat plane for the foliage. It came in at 273 triangles. Finally, we'll look at the final scene. I'll load up a slightly modified version of the scene used in the foliage video. This contains all the models created and placed to show how they will work in a full environment. I've added a hemisphere with a sky texture applied to it, which will be our sky dome, and then positioned the cheaper flat tree wall at the back and the more expensive ones in the middle. I placed some of the cheaper tree models in the background and the regular version in the middle to foreground. In this scene, the tree walls are a lot closer than you probably see them in game, as it's only designed to be viewed from one angle. But this should give you a good idea of how to lay the models. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next guide. For support with this video and any of the others in the series, log on to www.3d4games.com/forum and your questions will be answered once you've logged in. Good luck and goodbye.